Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And I've been rereading Samuel Beckett's play, Waiting for Godot.
And I've been reading Leanne Simpson's Theory of Water, Anishinaabe Maps to the Times Ahead.
So, listeners, please get yourself a comfy drink, pull up a seat, and join us for a conversation about these books and more here at the Spouter-Inn. Well, I have brought to the table a play. And we've done plays before. We've done some Shakespeare.
We did The Tempest ages ago. I think that's the only Shakespeare play we did, right?
Yes, but we've done some ancient Greek plays.
We haven't really talked about drama as such, though, have we?
Well, I mean, only a little bit. And I suppose, we are reading these as books, I guess. Is that sort of more typical for you? Do you think you go and see a lot of plays, or are the plays that you read also the plays that you see? Like, how do these things tie together for you?
Well, funnily enough, drama has always been one of the things that I feel is like, I don't want to say a weak point exactly, but I always feel like it's a mode that I never have felt really totally at home in. Like, so I'll enjoy reading plays, like Shakespeare plays in particular, and I'll watch plays sometimes, but I never feel, how can I put it? Like, there are people who'll say, oh no, reading a play, that's a poor reflection of what's going on. It's really the stage production that gives you, like, I don't know, not unmediated access, but like gives you access to drama the way it should be. But for some reason, I have a little hard time with that. I'm, by contrast, super at home in and in love with film, right? So it's kind of a funny thing. Do you feel at home in the world of drama?
A bit, I suppose. I'm not going off to see plays as frequently as I might like. There's a bit of I guess you have to leave the house, and that's a bit of a challenge sometimes. But I'm always happy when I do that, and I have a bit of experience. I'm not an actor. I'm not a playwright. I took a playwriting class when I was in college as a teenager, and I had nothing. I had no idea. I had nothing to say. But later in life, I did find myself sort of attached to this experimental theater group out in Portland, and I was involved in some of their productions and talking with them and so forth. And just, they really helped inform some of how I think about theater, about sort of performance in general. Just that desire to recognize that sort of we're all here in this moment and something is happening, and it is like live. It is not polished to a T necessarily, and in a good way. Like, there's a chance for something to happen, which I think is what people are getting at when they say seeing a production is quite different from reading the book. And I agree, they're different, but they both can be quite good.
It's interesting that, hearing you say that, because I'm thinking about how you have a lot of experience both with literary production, like as a poet, right, which is different from, but maybe complementary to someone who writes plays. And then also you have a lot of experience with performance, right, because through musical performance and so on. And even though improvisation in music isn't the same thing as experimental drama, I feel like there's a common ground.
Oh, well, I mean, there can be, absolutely. And I think, again, the things that I learned from hanging out with theater kids, I guess, and in particular theater kids who were really interested in pushing the boundaries and thinking deeply and sort of fundamentally about what theater is, and not to make it sound too silly, but it informed my poetry, it informed my music. It even, back in my academic career, I gave a pretty good conference paper, and a lot of that was because I was drawing upon things that I learned from the theater, just in terms of like, what does it mean to stand in front of people and do something and have their attention? And I was very mindful of that when I was given a talk about some medieval text. And so I feel like, there are going to always be plays where like you read them and you love them and you don't like any performances you see of them, as well as plays where you read them and you don't think much of them, and then you see a performance and you're like, oh yeah, that's amazing. Or the other way around, where you see a great performance and then you read the play and it's like, you can remember the good performance, but you don't see it on the page in the same way. And I don't know, I kind of love that tension.
Yeah, it's kind of neat also thinking about the ways in which the play exists in time as opposed to the way your reading of the book exists in time. Like, we talk frequently about, whenever we talk about a book that one or both of us has read a number of times, what was it like reading it this time? How is it different from your early experience? Like, because the book hasn't changed, but how have you changed between these different times of reading? And there's that same kind of contingent temporality with a play, but I don't know how much of it's coming from you attending the play as it's coming from the play being continuously recreated. I guess it's happening in both places, right?
Yeah. And similarly, like, there are so many more interpretive decisions happening when you see a play that are going on outside of your head, so to speak, versus when you read it yourself. I think about audiobooks this way. And, when I listen to an audiobook, that is more of an interpretation, more of someone else's interpretation on the text than mine. But like, there's a bit of math, so to speak, you can do to triangulate that idea of a text that is somehow coming to you uninterpreted, although of course it's always been interpreted even on a page because the page has been designed, the cover's been like, there are all sorts of things mediating it for you. We just ignore some of the paratexts sometimes.
Yeah, they become almost invisible, right? Unless you look for them.
Yeah. Anyway, it's a fun topic, and I'm excited to think about this play in particular in terms of that. Stage directions. Estragon takes Vladimir's hat. Vladimir adjusts Lucky's hat on his head. Estragon puts on Vladimir's hat in place of his own, which he hands to Vladimir. Vladimir takes Estragon's hat. Estragon adjusts Vladimir's hat on his head. Vladimir puts on Estragon's hat in place of Lucky's, which he hands to Estragon. Estragon takes Lucky's hat. Vladimir adjusts Estragon's hat on his head. Estragon puts on Lucky's hat in place of Vladimir's, which he hands to Vladimir. Vladimir takes his hat. Estragon adjusts Lucky's hat on his head. Vladimir puts on his hat in place of Estragon's, which he hands to Estragon. Estragon takes his hat. Vladimir adjusts his hat on his head. Estragon puts on his hat in place of Lucky's, which he hands to Vladimir. Vladimir takes Lucky's hat. Estragon adjusts his hat on his head. Vladimir puts on Lucky's hat in place of his own, which he hands to Estragon. Estragon takes Vladimir's hat. Vladimir adjusts Lucky's hat on his head. Estragon hands Vladimir's hat back to Vladimir, who takes it and hands it back to Estragon, who takes it and hands it back to Vladimir, who takes it and throws it down. You chuckled. I heard you chuckling at the end of my reading of that.
It's a unique stage direction.
It's so Beckett, and I love it. And I know that it was impossible to follow as a listener. It's impossible to follow as a reader unless you really sit there and map it out. And in a sense, like, it requires a kind of embodiment. I mean, it's actually not that complicated. They're just sort of rotating hats and trying them on and rotating them again. But like, to explain that requires such confusing detail, or I guess it doesn't have to, but he's embodying the confusion of these hats going around and the structure and system of these hats going around in the stage directions, which I just love.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting way too, right? Because there's this passing, right? Like putting on the hat, handing the hat. But then there's also this really interesting verb, adjusts.
Yes.
Right? What does that mean? I know what it means in everyday, but like, it seems it opens up all this space, doesn't it?
It totally does. And it opens up some interpretive space, right? There's a bunch of different ways you can adjust.
Yeah.
I think it depends on, how you're doing with the character. But the important thing is, like, there's a bit of business, as they say. There's a bit of, you're doing something on stage. You're doing something that might express a bit of your character, that might be a bit funny or silly or whatnot. But like, you're doing some prop work, and it's not just putting on your head, you're putting on, and then you're adjusting it. Like, it's an extra beat to this action to hone it in and make it more real.
And it must come as such a, how can I put it, contrast with a play that is very, very word dependent, like very wordy, right? And in ways that we'll probably talk about. Like, action sits in an odd spot, and props, which are used pretty abstemiously in productions of Godot, right?
Abstemiously, that is a very fun word, but yeah, absolutely.
So like, there's all kinds of weird stuff going on here.
Yeah. Let me give a little biography for Beckett before I go into more detail about Waiting for Godot specifically. Although I will say, Samuel Beckett is a very important writer to me. Like, I encountered his work when I was a teenager. I read Waiting for Godot first. I was surprised by it. I was surprised by how funny it was, in addition to being sort of dark and, I don't want to quite say nihilistic, but something approaching that. And I loved it. I read so much of his stuff, and then I haven't gone back to him in so long. this is like the longest gap for somebody this important to me, it feels like. So I'm delighted to revisit him, but it's interesting to think about, like, why haven't I gone back to Beckett in a while? Well,
Yeah.
we'll get to that, I suppose. So Samuel Beckett was born in Dublin in 1906. When he was a young adult in college, he met James Joyce and became a huge booster of his work. He would go on to travel a bunch and settle in Paris in the late 30s, just before the outbreak of World War II, during which time he joined the French resistance, which he would downplay, but he did do some work with the French resistance, so that seems good. During that time, and for many years afterwards, he would write poetry, novels, short prose works, and most famously, plays. Most of his mature work was originally written in French and then translated by Beckett himself into English, including Waiting for Godot. And there's a certain characteristic that we find in some of his very earliest work where it's clearly he's been reading a lot of Joyce. He's absolutely drunken the Joyce Kool-Aid, so to speak. The language is exuberant. It's alluding everywhere. It's very Baroque in the way that Ulysses or even Finnegan's Wake would be. But over time and before too long, it first on takes a lot of darker themes than you might find in Joyce, but also it becomes much more spare and pared down. So that by the time we get to Waiting for Godot, things are much more abstemious. He's clearly interested in writing a play in which nothing happens, and then for Act 2, nothing happens again. And I think that's sort of the interesting tension of Waiting for Godot. There is so little there. It was a shockingly little amount of stuff happening. It took a while for it to become a popular play in some places. I think because they went to see a play and it was just two people standing around for the most part, not doing anything, talking about how they weren't doing anything, and there's no character development or arc, it would seem, like no plot anyways. There's just a handful of little props on stage and, that's it.
But it did become popular ultimately, right? And what do you attribute that to? Like what made, how can I put it, made something that is so, I don't know, kind of closet drama, do you know what I mean? So different from other kinds of drama that you would find on the stage. What made it then take off and become something that could draw in audiences?
I think a number of people sort of got the basic idea that, like, this is not a bug, it's a feature, that this is sort of what it's about. Also, I mean, and I hope this is the case, it's a very funny play. The two main characters, Vladimir and Estragon, who are, standing on a country road by a barren tree waiting for this guy named Godot to show up. It's all very unclear, but like that's what they're doing. They're just standing there and they're trying to pass the time talking about this or that. And, it's all kind of boring and bleak, but the two characters are also kind of straight out of vaudeville.
Mm-hmm,
and they're constantly doing little bits with each other. They're throwing back and forth. They're setting up and knocking down little jokes. Like it's all in the world. It's all grounded in this bleak situation of them being two men in pain, two old men in pain. Like Estragon has this foot that aches because his shoes don't fit, and Vladimir has bladder trouble, and so he's constantly aching there and wandering off stage to pee. They're constantly doing little things back and forth, and there's a real rhythm, and it is extremely slapstick and vaudeville. I mean, they're throwing hats and passing them around to each other for a minute or two there. It's very silly.
Yeah, so it has this weird combination of being, on the one hand, I don't want to say elevated exactly, but being kind of like really abstruse, right? Like doing certain things with language, playing a certain kind of game. You, like you said earlier, you can connect it with Joyce's work in certain ways in terms of language. And also it's got this, like, I don't know what to call it, low vernacular thing happening, like this vaudeville-like quality, the playfulness, the comedy.
Yeah. And like several parts of it point towards big or deeper themes. Like in addition to just some of the speeches that happen about like, oh, we're waiting, and like they're stuck in this seemingly endless loop that's going to go nowhere. They're waiting for somebody whose name is sometimes pronounced Godot, but is also often pronounced Godot, and either way it starts G-O-D. Like, it feels like a somewhat obvious thing, although I think Beckett didn't like to agree to that interpretation that they're waiting for God to show up. But all of this keeps pointing towards a kind of existentialist meaning. Existentialist might be the wrong word again, but like,
Well, it's funny you say that because I'm just thinking about Sartre No Exit,
yeah,
which is like obviously a very different kind of play, but it's, I wonder if there's a shared milieu to a certain extent, right? Like, I can't remember when the first productions of No Exit took place, but is it in the same period? Is it the same decade, the 50s?
it's a little earlier. It's from 1944, but I think that there's a bit of awareness of it. And again, like that's a small 3 people play in a kind of abstract space.
Exactly.
Where they're just talking to each other, but the characters have a bit more. Well, I don't want to say that like there's no personality between Vladimir and Estragon. Like they're definitely, your distinct comedy duo, like a Laurel and Hardy or whoever. They have very distinct personalities.
But they're like two halves of a whole, though.
Yeah, like they belong together, and they talk constantly about how maybe they should be breaking up. But like, no, they're not going to break up. Like they're clearly in a double act.
Well, how does Lucky fit into that?
Right. So at some point in the middle of the first act, this haughty guy named Pozzo enters, and he's got a servant on a rope named Lucky. And like, what is going on here? Well, in a certain sense, to me, it always felt like at first it's just something else for them to do. Like, how do we stretch out doing nothing for 2 hours for the length of the play? And part of it is to just keep bringing in little things that they can work with. And this is the major thing in the first act.
Like more props.
Yeah, like they're more props. And so you've got this sort of haughty master type who's looking down on Vladimir and Estragon, and who has this person on a rope who doesn't say anything at first. And Vladimir and Estragon are like, oh, you're being so abusive to him. What's going on? Why does he do this? Why does he do that? And like, there's a whole kind of arc to this, culminating after quite a lot of, again, wandering around in circles for a bit, culminating in one of the most astonishing moments in the play, where Pozzo commands his servant to think. And they put a hat on him, and like Frosty the Snowman, he's suddenly coming to life and able to talk. And he thinks. He gives this phenomenally convoluted, somewhat Joycean, I would say, thinking speech that goes on longer than any other single speech in the play. Like, he's got essentially one line, but what a line it is. I've always intended to sort of memorize it. It starts, given the existence as uttered forth in the public works of Puncher and Watman of a personal god, quack, 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 with white beard, quack, 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 outside time, without extension, who from the heights of divine apathia, divine athambia, divine aphasia, loves us dearly, with some exceptions for reasons unknown, but it just goes on for 10 times what I just did.
Very Joycean.
Very Joycean, very fun in a very different way. Just like the business with the hat swapping around is very fun in a different way. Like, Beckett is squeezing different types of comedy out of as limited a set of props and situations as he'll allow himself right now, to make the 2 hours go by. And that's one of the things that I've always enjoyed about it is how much it tries to exhaust its material.
You said earlier that it's remarkable that this is an author and a play that meant a lot to you, but such a long span of time has elapsed since when you were very much involved with it and coming back to it now. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. I don't know. Maybe this is ungenerous, and I probably should spend more time with Beckett again before saying this too much. But like, I think there's something very appealing to a young person about the kind of nihilistic humor of Waiting for Godot and some of his other works. They're so spare. They're so bleak. And like, Waiting for Godot is Beckett's first published and performed play. Not the first one he wrote, but the first one that was published. And it feels decadent and baroque and filled with stuff compared with what's coming later in his work. You know, he will become much more spare, and there will be much less going on, and the characters will be stuck significantly more than Vladimir and Estragon are. So like, this feels like a rich cake of activity to me now when I think about Beckett plays. But there's something about that, like, striving for this text of nothingness, this text that so many of his later works, so many of his short fiction pieces, which are kind of the works of his that I love the most, are about seemingly the last moment of life, just like capturing the barest possible thing and watching it fizzle out.
Mm.
There's one of his short fiction pieces called Imagination Dead Imagine, which is already the striking kind of name for it. And it's about, so to speak, like two bodies in a, I don't know, rotunda, in a kind of architectural enclosed space being imagined by somebody, but like that imagination fizzling out.
Mm-hmm.
It's bleak, and it's bleak in a way that might appeal a lot to a teenager.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Although returning to it now, returning to Waiting for Godot in particular, like old men who are feeling pains all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I relate to that more than I did.
So the way of relating to it is very different.
It's so much more felt. As somebody who's it's so much more felt. And my concerns and I guess fantasies about death and dying are so much different now than they were when I was 20 that those pieces might hit differently now too.
Well, you opened up talking about embodiment and the ways in which that comes out in the stage direction, right? And that focus on embodiment is maybe really different from what you would have responded to when you were reading this as a very young person.
Yes, although when I read it as a very young person and I got very excited about it, the first thing I did was lent it to my best friend and said to her, we should put on a performance of this. Not because, not like we weren't actors, like that was the thing. Just like, let's do it so that we can understand this text better, so that we can know what it's like to physically go through this. Because I want to understand, I want to internalize this play as much as possible. And just like I might, find the chords to a song and play it out on a guitar, not because I want it to be a fantastic performance, but just as a way to understand it. I wanted to do this with this play.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, it's not a feeling I've had about any other play I've read, though, I've certainly done a few like table reads with friends of Shakespeare plays and things like that. Like, it's a great thing to do. But this was the first one where it was like, you gotta do this.
So did you guys actually do it?
Of course not. We were teenagers. That wasn't going to happen. I don't know if she was as excited about, I think she liked it, but I don't think she was excited about the idea of like, I don't know, memorizing the lines or whatever that I was, but whatever. It didn't happen, but that's okay.
Huh. The only time I encountered this play was also as a very young person, and it was in college. It was my last year of college, and the guy I was going out with was in a production of Waiting for Godot.
Oh, what was he playing?
Pazzo.
Oh, probably the least fun role of
I know.
all.
I think he was understudying I think Estragon. I think he was understudying.
Sure.
But my knowledge of the play comes not from reading it, but from having been at, a certain number of rehearsals and performances. So funnily enough, that's how I know it.
How was that performance?
It was incredibly boring.
Yeah. Did it seem funny? Like, were they
I found myself very impatient with it. And, maybe that's me, maybe that's, especially because, when we were reading Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, remember we talked about, I talked a little bit about bouncing off that text and being interested in Joyce, but like not, getting like, when you're in the ocean and you're swimming and the waves are just too much and you just really can't get out there. Like, that's how I felt about Finnegan's Wake. And it's kind of how I felt about this play too. I was like, man, there's a lot of language in this. And I was like, I didn't know what to do with it.
Interesting. I mean, the language isn't that complicated, and it does repeat itself in pleasing ways. I don't know. I have found that there are people who read the text, don't like it, and then when somebody says, it's funny, and then they go back to it and they're like, oh, I could definitely imagine a college performance of it not
I was going to say
that it's funny.
It could be also that it was not that great a performance. It's totally possible.
Some of the great productions or fabled productions of it have involved comedians. The first American production had Burt Lahr, the Cowardly Lion from The Wizard of Oz, playing one of the main characters. And there's a famous production from 1988 that I remember reading about at the time, and I wish I'd been able to see it, but I was too young, with Robin Williams and Steve Martin.
Oh my God, that must have been incredible.
As Vladimir and Estragon. And the others were Bill Irwin, the clown guy, F. Murray Abraham, and as the young boy who comes in and says Godot isn't going to be able to make it today, he'll be back tomorrow for sure. It was a young Lucas Haas.
Really?
Yeah. Like, what a
Wow.
lineup. I think there are videos of it out there, but like, that's not going to be the same.
That I would like to see, though. That sounds amazing.
Yeah. Oh, I really wish I had been there.
Yeah.
There's a production going on. I don't know if it's still going on, but it happened recently.
Yeah.
It's with Keanu Reeves and Alex Winter, Bill and Ted doing it. I think it got fairly mixed reviews, but
It's a great concept, though, like picking up on that whole vaudeville shtick, two guys kind of thing you were talking about
yeah,
earlier.
I don't know. I would have seen it. I would have gone and checked it out. But alas, I've never actually seen a live production of Waiting for Godot. There's a collection that came out on DVD like 20 years ago called Beckett on Film, where they did all of Beckett's plays, but got different directors to film them. The director of Waiting for Godot is Michael Lindsay Hogg, the guy who directed the Let It Be movie, the original one, not the revised version, whatever. It's fine, but it's not the same as the one that happened in my head.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, the potential performance is always so much better than any of the real ones, right?
yeah. But, the other thing that I think you might like about it, although, maybe not as evident in Waiting for Godot as in some of his other work, is his interest in these kinds of systems, these systems that he builds, like the hat thing from what I read at the beginning. That's a whole like system of this doing that and this doing that. And it doesn't mean anything, but it becomes incredibly important as a system. And a lot of Beckett's works are like that. One of my favorite passages in literature is from his novel Malloy. And it's it's Malloy who carries a bunch of stones around with him in his pockets, and he likes to suck on them. And just for several pages, he elaborates the system he uses to ensure that he sort of sucks on them all about the same.
That must be incredibly difficult.
Yeah, it's like he goes through and he puts it in this pocket, and then he puts it, and then once they're all in that pocket, he's able to start the process backwards. But it's like very specifically detailed in a way that I find incredibly satisfying.
How do you make sure you get the correct rock out of your pocket at any given time?
Yeah, well, the important thing is to make sure that you don't do a rock twice in a row before you've done all of them, right?
Yes, of course.
So you need multiple pockets.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. It's a passage that I absolutely love. I'd be curious to hear what you think about it someday.
Huh.
And that kind of complicated, detailed description of a system, but a system that is ultimately meaningless and doomed and like shows off the level of absurd nothingness going on in the characters' lives. Which, I don't know, that's so Beckett, and it just does something for me.
Yeah. Well, even in that passage you read, like one of the things that really strikes me about it is the way in which it feels almost like a loop that could go on endlessly, right? It just feels like it's chugging on and chugging on and chugging on. And then it kind of breaks, right? Estragon hands Vladimir's hat back to Vladimir. Vladimir takes it, gives it back to Estragon. Estragon takes it, gives it back to Vladimir. And then he takes it and throws it down.
Yeah.
And it's such a funny moment, right? Because a thing that looked like it could go on in this cyclical way, like forever, like in perpetuity, like it gets broken. And so it's probably too much to call it like an act of violence, but like, it like breaks. And so that's kind of interesting.
Yeah. And I think from a sort of directing point of view, like you want to hold that action of exchanging hats for an uncomfortable length of time.
Right.
Where it feels like, is this ever going to end?
Mm-hmm.
Is this ever going to end?
Mm-hmm.
And then right when you've got people tense enough, then you let it break.
Mm-hmm.
And what a relief that is. And yet, what are you relieved about? Like they were just passing hats around.
Yeah, it was nothing, right?
That's the magic of theater.
I became fascinated by sintering. When a snowflake falls from the sky and lands on the earth, it immediately begins, or perhaps continues, a transformation as it forms bonds at temperatures below zero with its neighboring snowflakes or crystals to create the fabric of a snowpack. Sintering is a joining. It is a communal transformation that creates a fabric of former snowflakes bonded to each other. As the snow sinters, it settles and becomes denser, stronger, and soggier under the influence of gravity. Sintering is slow deformation. This passage from Leanne Simpson's Theory of Water, Anishinaabe Maps to the Times Ahead, is, I feel like, sometimes it's really hard to choose a cold open passage, but this one was very easy to choose because this idea of sintering and this word sintering, which I had not encountered before, is this really powerful, I want to say metaphor, but it's more than a metaphor, a kind of language you can use to talk about something that informs the book as a whole in terms of ways of doing things. And also, I think, kind of informs Leanne Simpson's work a little bit more broadly. That is, it's a thing that happens in the natural world that can also inform the ways in which people relate to one another. And that sounds deceptively simple and even kind of reductive, but there's a whole, I don't know if this is the right word for it or not, there's a whole political philosophy of sintering that underlies the book and also some of her writing, I think, more generally. So it's kind of cool.
Yeah. Now, we've looked at one of her books before.
Yeah, back when we did a little bundle of 4 episodes that were on essaying and storying and essay and story, we discussed another book of hers that came out back in 2011 called Dancing on Our Turtle's Back, Stories of Nishnabek Recreation, Resurgence, and a New Emergence. And I really think about those 2 books in some ways as kind of counterparts of one another. And that's something we might talk about a little bit together. But maybe first I should say just a little bit about the writer who we introduced when we did the earlier episode, but I want to introduce her briefly again today, I think. So Leanne Betasamasek Simpson is a Michisagik Nishnabeg scholar, a writer, a musician, and an artist. She writes fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and music. And her work includes the novel Nupiming, The Cure for White Ladies, which was shortlisted for the Governor General's Literary Award in Canada, as well as the Dublin Literary Prize. And she also wrote a nonfiction collaboration with Robin Maynard called Rehearsals for Living, which was also shortlisted for the Governor General's Award. And among her various books, I'm really looking forward to reading a collection of short stories that she wrote, Islands of Decolonial Love. I tend to be drawn more to nonfiction than fiction these days, so that's why I've read mostly her nonfiction. But I feel like having gotten my toes wet there, I think I'm gonna move on into the fiction.
I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
And this is a new book of hers, right?
Yeah, it just came out actually a few months ago. It came out in 2025. And I was really looking forward to it, like from when I first saw it announced, because I really enjoyed Dancing on Our Turtle's Back. And I enjoyed it in itself, but I in particular enjoyed the ways in which she gives you a kind of way of reading and way of doing things that is grounded very specifically in her own community and her own culture. So not just Indigenous, but Anishinaabe, and not just Anishinaabe, but a particular community of Anishinaabe people, Michisagig. She talks also about the, homelands of her community in the area of what's now Peterborough, Ontario, right? So it's very specific and very local, but in a way that allows you to kind of extrapolate. And so Dancing on Our Turtle's Back gives you a sense of this land-based approach to, thinking about not just literature and language, but like I said, ways of doing things more broadly. And when Theory of Water first got announced, I was really excited because I had been thinking a lot about, how do you go from land-based learning and land-based knowledge to thinking about water-based, how does that look different? And so it was incredibly satisfying when the book came out to be like, yes, this is very cool. So it's a great book for thinking with, I feel. Have you, I know you took a peek at Dancing on Our Turtle's Back. Did you take a peek at this book, or do you just know a little bit about it?
Well, I haven't read it, but I've seen it around, and it seems very popular, at least around these parts. It seems like it's doing very well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a short book, a little bit, let's see, I was looking, a little bit longer than Dancing on Our Turtle's Back. It's like, I don't know, less than 200 pages, but very rich. Like I was going to say dense, but that sometimes sounds pejorative. Like I find her writing to be really like, you can sort of squeeze the juice out of that orange over a long period of time. You know what I mean? There's a lot in it. And so I find that I've read it a few times already. And so I'll read it really fast, and then I'll read it slowly, and then I'll read a section, so it just, it in a way that's very different from most, a lot of the nonfiction I read, which feels less full. So yeah. And like I said, it sort of feels in some ways like a counterpart to Dancing on a Turtle's Back, one land-based, one water-based. And even if you just look at the books, like the binding of Dancing on Our Turtle's Back, it's this beautiful green cover, which is evoking the turtle's shell, but also is like the color of growing things, right? And Theory of Water is like this beautiful blue artwork, blue, multicolors of blue, right? So it's like, they feel like counterparts on the shelf. But it's kind of neat to see how the structure of the two books is kind of different, because I'm always drawn to structure, right? So like Dancing on Our Turtle's Back is in 8 chapters, and each one of them is in multiple parts. And she really like kind of, they have an anatomy almost, or like, I don't know, a geography almost, right? And Theory of Water is in 23 short chapters of varying length. So like the flow is really different, but of course that really makes sense because they're governed by a different kind of sort of operating principle, right? Land and water. So that's I like that about it.
Yeah. And I mean, I have to ask, like, one of the words in the subtitle to the book is maps. And I know you are very excited about maps in both sort of normal, figurative, but also metaphorical senses. How do maps play? What kind of maps are we talking about here?
That's a really, really interesting question. I do love maps. I love maps in every way. I could just do that forever. One of the things that happens in the book is that she has a chapter that's called Maps to Statelessness that very specifically kind of talks about maps and what would Anishinaabe mapping look like. And it becomes kind of abstract. And I feel like the discussion of mapping in that chapter and in the book more generally, paradoxically, you would think those are the parts that I would feel most on top of and have a deepest understanding of. But they're the parts that I'm most like, wow, I have to think about this more. I have to think about how this is working more. So that's kind of like I said, paradoxical, but also really satisfying. And I think it's because, again, this sort of organizational principle of water and, or Nibi, she uses the term in Anishinaabe, right? So just for water. And if we were talking from a kind of, I don't know, the framework of the educational systems that we grew up in, we would describe this as kind of personification, right? She understands Nibi, she understands water as living, as a being, right? That has a set of relationships and so on. And so she unfolds this in a really rich way especially in the opening couple of chapters of the book. And I'm just going to read a couple of words here from the opening of chapter 2, where she's kind of opening out this idea of water as a theory. She said, when she was just finishing her book, Rehearsals of Living, I began to think about water, Nibi, as a theory or a mapping of life and affiliation and global connection. In other words, as a form of indigenous internationalism. I became interested in thinking alongside water as it traveled the globe over and over, moving inside and outside bodies across all kinds of borders, and as it changed form from solid to liquid to gas. And I remain interested in its continual movement and cycling, its immense relationship with all forms of life on the planet. So you can see how she's like kind of moving outward from this particularity of Nibi, right? That she's using a term from her own language, right? So it's very local and specific, but out into this big framework as a form of indigenous internationalism and in terms of like the movement of water, right? So not just in the ways in which we might try to map, but also movement through different states of matter, right? So there's this really expansive and I guess you could say multi-dimensional way of understanding mapping of water, right? And it's a theory, which I think is really important and interesting.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
I know there's a lot going on, right?
There's a lot there. And I'm really interested in, I think, 3 of the things that I've pulled out of what you've said that struck me. One of them is, okay, we've got this notion of water as something that sort of spills and transforms and goes from one area to another. The river becomes the ocean, which goes into another ocean, which evaporates into the air, which, all sorts of like water keeps flowing and moving and flows in different ways and becomes different things and so forth. So you have that notion of the spread and transformativeness and boundlessness of water. And you've got this notion of statelessness that you brought up, which strikes me as, an interesting connection to that, right? Like the river sort of stays put maybe, but the water doesn't stay put. The water in the river doesn't stay where it is. And then like this other idea of like sintering that you started with, these snowflakes sort of joining together, transforming, but becoming something else in that moment of connection. As she said, becoming denser, stronger, but also soggier, but also deforming.
Mm-hmm.
And all of these ideas are bouncing off each other in my head right now in interesting ways.
Yeah, right. I mean, so she's making this move from, like I said, the local to this international scale, right? Like what it means to line up different kinds of commitment, like different communities in shared commitments to work together towards some shared goals, right? And I think it's really significant that she doesn't do that through talking about water in its like flowing state, where everything just sort of melts into this like diffuse liquidity, like, I don't know, like a melting pot even, like totally not doing that. Instead, she's going to do something quite different, and it's going to be through that. And I don't want to use the word metaphor because she doesn't use the word metaphor, and it's not just the metaphor, right? But through this idea of centering. So like just a couple pages after that passage I read a little bit earlier, she kind of brings out, how water works, and then how you can extract that into what she calls a theory. And I think it's really interesting and important that she uses the word theory. She says this. She says, the theory of Nibby asks us to think on a scale that is outside the present moment and our own immediate needs. I'm thinking about Nibby as theory here because Nibby offers us an invitation to learn from its embodied practice, a practice of cycling that is global, is permeable, and brings about a continuous rebirth on our planet. And it goes on at greater length. And elsewhere in the book, she's going to kind of extrapolate exactly what that would look like. But the theory part, and I think, like I said, I think it's really interesting she uses this word theory because she's going to talk a lot about practice, right? Or at least she's going to point us in the direction of different kinds of practices of solidarity. But the theory is what's going to make it all hang together. And I'm always so fascinated when reading Indigenous writers, seeing what kinds of terms, or I guess you could say like epistemologies, they'll invoke that are from, like, I guess, Western tradition, right? Like are from, that exist in the Western tradition, right? That make sense to draw over, that are like almost like conceptual bridges that make sense in both of these environments. Some of these terms don't show up. Like I said, for example, she doesn't say anything about metaphor, right? So that's why I don't want to really use that word in talking about centering, but she does use theory. So I think that's kind of neat. And then centering, like I was starting to say a little bit earlier, as a choice for the language that will be used to talk about how people can engage in these kinds of Indigenous solidarities. In that passage that I started with, she brings out how centering is a kind of a joining, right? A little after the passage I read, she says, it's a communal transformation that creates a fabric of former snowflakes bonded to each other, right? They make a kind of rounded form of bonded crystals. And what she says about that is like, it's not that they lose their form. It's not that they cease to exist as individuals, right? But they're like soggy, right? They're kind of up against each other. And then she says this really neat thing. Groomers, like people who are maintaining snowpaths, groomers pay attention to centering because there is nothing like skating along a well-groomed trail of packed snow. It feels like flying. And then she'll go on and define it in a lot of different ways. And she'll say, for example, centering is bonding. It is building coalitions with your neighbors, right? So that's where she's kind of unpacking what it means in practice. But I love the way that what it enables is not like a loss of identity of any one of these individual snowflakes or anything like that. What it enables is it lets you go fast, right? It feels like flying, right? It enables stuff to happen. And I just think that's such an interesting way of theorizing what becomes possible when you line up these different, I don't know, community priorities.
So in this system, or in this passage at least, when you first read it, I found myself empathizing with, or let's say seeing myself in the snowflakes. That, snowflakes as things that are joined together, that are bonded to each other, with the follow-up being, well, let's think more about what happens to those snowflakes as they become part of a snowpack. Like as they continue connected to each other, they become denser, stronger, and soggier, like a fuller sense of what it means to become bonded into a community came out of that. And it was more striking because it pushed the thoughts about that further by accurately describing what's going on in that process. Not to overdetermine things, but like, are we the snow? Are we the person sliding on the snow? Is this something sliding on the snow, something else? I know it doesn't have to be a one-to-one mapping like that.
No, but that's such a good question. And I think she's really inviting us to think that through. She has this nice little passage where she says, "Sintering in the forest is easy for me. Sintering with people I'm currently sharing the planet with, much more difficult. These days, I ask myself if sintering could play a role in grounding my method of solidarity, in strengthening and renewing connections across communities of struggle toward new constellations of co-resistance. Could sintering be a foundational concept for creating such constellations?" So I think what we're being invited to think about there is, how can I put it? You might be the snowflakes, right, that are becoming slowly deformed, right? But it's going to enable this kind of movement. And it may be that you are not even participating in the movement, like flying over the snow, right? But you're part of what creates the conditions of possibility. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, I feel like that's why, like, one of the reasons why metaphor I think is not a very satisfactory term. It's almost like, I don't know, it's like a figurative way of speaking that changes the more you use it and kind of can be unpacked in these different ways. And in that sense, could be lined up with storying, which we talked about in connection with reading Lee Maricle's work, where there's this kind of generative kind of quality, storying it up. Here, it feels like this is an interpretive mode, but it's also generative in a very comparable kind of way.
Yeah, in an observational mode, like observing what is going on and having, from my point of view, this is maybe not the term she would use, but having a fellow feeling with it.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And that's one of the things that happens throughout the book. And you might remember also talking about this when we were looking at Dancing on Our Turtle's Back. She'll recount periods of time spent on the land, either by herself or with her very beloved teacher, who she talks about here too, Doug Williams. And then that becomes the ground for talking about a whole range of things, you know, she sort of unpacks all the layers that can be found when you like sort of listen and look in this attentive way. And so then she actualizes this, you know, as you go through the book, she sort of moves out to talk about what this might mean in practice, you know, connecting with other kinds of nations. Like even in the very opening of the book, she'll connect what she calls our present moment with all other kinds of catastrophes happening elsewhere in the world. She'll say, the present moment, she says, one of climate catastrophe, of ongoing genocide and Nakba in Gaza, Palestine, of genocides in Sudan and Congo, demands that we direct our dreams and actions toward making worlds that refuse capitalism and dispossession and the spectacular violences required to maintain them. Right, so she kind of puts that on the table already very early in the book. And then as you go through the book, she makes these moves toward a whole range of thinkers from different nations, right, indigenous to different continents, and kind of unpacks how you can sort of line up these different approaches with one another. Like, not to reduce the difference that separates them one from another, but to enable possibility, you know, enable you to fly over the snow, right? So she'll talk, for example, about Cedric Robinson. She talks about someone talking to her about Cedric Robinson's work as a kind of Black anti-fascism. She says, and I thought about what Indigenous anti-fascism might look like, and Anishinaabeg anti-fascism, Michisaugig Nishnabeg anti-fascism. That is, I wondered, what would it look like to have a critique of fascism from within the formation of thought, and perhaps a specific school of thought of the Michisaugig Nishnabeg? What would it mean to have the sort of structuring and organizing that occurs outside what we usually imagine when we think of movements and anti-fascist writers and scholarship on these issues? What would it look like to have a school of thought that is largely embodied, that is oral, and that has been under attack since contact? Right? So again, there's that really interesting move to say, well, what if an international movement isn't like this kind of generic, I don't know, kind of top-down flattening of difference, but instead is intensely local, right? Not just indigenous, not just Anishinaabe, but Michisaugig Nishnabeg, right? And that's for her how she's going to frame it. Other people are going to frame it in these other ways. But through this sintering, right, just that's what I mean by as a guiding principle, it becomes possible to go fast, right? It becomes possible to do things together.
That is really interesting. And I am very encouraged, let's say, to hear her talking about her encounters with other forms of anti-fascist thought that are coming from other communities and feeling an ability to communicate with them and perhaps at some point center with them, so to speak, but not to require them to be the same or to end up framed the same way or like there's still a distinction that's based in each group's specificity, even though they perhaps flow into each other sympathetically.
Yeah, that the centering is possible, right? That there's this kind of alignment that becomes possible, right? This becoming soggy, kind of, right? That becomes possible. Yeah, she does this in a really interesting way because it would be all too easy, I think, for this kind of political vision she's outlining here to seem, I don't know, like essentialist, where there's a Anishinaabe way of thinking about, these political commitments. And there's this, I don't know, North African way of thinking about it. And, all of these different, because she actually takes pains to point out how much of a gap there already is between her experiences as a Anishinaabe thinker in the 21st century, right? And that which her ancestors would have experienced. In other words, there's a gap between past Anishinaabe people and present day ones already. Like it's always kind of being formed and reformed in response to the circumstances that people find themselves in. She has a really nice quotation about this. She says, as I think about the work Nibi does, I am reminded that my ancestors didn't struggle with world making the way I'm struggling with it after 4 centuries of colonialism. My ancestors recognized that worlds existed outside themselves on a planetary scale, composed of an incomprehensible diversity of life, maintained by complex nonlinear cycles. In this sense, they weren't really world making. They were building Anishinaabe lifeways to fit into a much larger communal way of living and bringing forth more life. We didn't have to invent anything. We merely had to fit in. So I think what she's doing there is not saying, oh, we should return to this long ago worldview, because that's not possible. You can't just go back to that. But instead recognizing what it is to be living under the circumstances that we live under now and reflecting that, right? And that's what becomes the ground on which you can kind of move outward to connecting with other kinds of sites of struggle, I guess you would say.
Yeah,
so it's really interesting. And she has this also incredibly interesting treatment of time more generally, which I at one and the same time find incredibly interesting and feel like I understand about 15% of it, right? It's so interesting.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like it's a really, it's a deep book. That's going to be a pun. That's a pun. I didn't mean that to be a pun. Oh no. But it sounds like it's a delightful book to swim around in. I'm just thinking of water puns now. I'm stuck.
Yeah, no, I get that. But it's a delight. It's a wonderful book to swim in. I mean, that's exactly the right feeling. And that's exactly how I feel about it because, I have gotten a lot out of it already. I feel like I've learned so much. I'm really grateful for that. And I also feel like there's so much more. I haven't been in this cove yet. I haven't been in the water when it's really cold. I just feel like there's an awful lot more there. So the section on time, which is actually the chapter that's on mapping too, mappings of the liminal. I really want to spend more time with that and think that through. One phrase she uses is this. She says, time is a mapping of cycles, a mapping of liminal space. Right? It's a very deceptive, short 2 sentences. There's an awful lot going on in there. So I'm really looking forward to unpacking that more. One of the other aspects of the book that I was very moved by is, I think I mentioned a little bit earlier, she talks in this book and also in her earlier book, Dancing on Our Turtle's Back, about her teacher, Doug Williams, another Anishinaabe person. And he's clearly really important to her. And by the time she writes Theory of Water, he's already passed on. And so the passages in which she talks about him are really poignant because I don't want to use the word elegiac, she doesn't use this word elegiac, and that's not the right word for it, but it's that you can really feel her pain in remembering his loss. And she keeps coming back to it in a way that's almost almost like worrying a sore spot, but it's productive, it's not futile. So she talks, for example, she talks most explicitly about his death in chapter 10, which is called Agaming on the Shore. And she talks about his death and says how in the months leading up to his death, how they talked a lot about Michisagi Anishinaabe beliefs and practices around the transition from physical and spiritual being to a solely spiritual one. Doug was spending more time in the spiritual world as his body retreated. And as he spent more time in this interstitial space, the space in between life and death, I was dragged there with him reluctantly. It was difficult for me to stay present where the physical and spiritual worlds overlapped because I didn't want to feel the feelings invoked there. And it goes on, and it's just very beautiful and sad, right? And there's a number of passages in which she kind of returns. She'll talk about it, and then she'll return to it later on about how he was aware that his, time to pass on was coming and what that was for her and how difficult that was to be present Anyway, so I was really moved by that because there was just these passages are really full of a lot of love. And, I think anybody who's had an important kind of, I want to say teacher relationship, it doesn't have to be like an official teacher, but like a relationship with someone from whom you've learned and you're going to be really sorry not to be with them. That's a really very deeply moving part of the book.
Well, a very old and beloved book and a very new and exciting book. I'm not saying it's not beloved as well, but a world of contrasts in today's episode. I suppose,
embodiment. I'm always struck by the ways in which we put these books together in this completely arbitrary way, right? It's like, what are you reading? What am I reading? But then there's often turns out to be something there that becomes a kind of shared substrate. And I think this embodiment stuff maybe is one of them.
I think so. Other than that, is there anything that you've been doing or reading lately or anything you're looking forward to?
I've been watching a lot of movies, and I do have one wonderful thing to report. I'm sure I've in the past alluded to this volume on textiles and manuscripts, a local and global history of the book that co-edited with friend of the podcast, Melissa Morton.
Yes.
We finally wrestled the final third proofs to bed. The book is out of our hands, lots of beautiful pictures. It's going to be printed in January, and we should have a hard copy in our hands by March. And at last. And so we'll have to find some way of sharing a link to the book and its pretty pictures at some point.
That's very exciting. That's a lot of work, and it's good. It's good to see the finish line in the distance coming closer.
Oh, yeah. And the contributions by the people who wrote the different pieces are absolutely stunning. So maybe at some point we'll have a little bonus chat about it or something.
Yeah. I have to say, I've been continuing to have a bit of health issues, so I've not been reading nearly as much as I would have liked lately. But one of the books that I did read or, listen to an audiobook of, which counts, is a new book that is about maps.
Ooh.
So there's a lovely YouTube channel called Map Men, where these two British smart, funny guys, I don't know, they put together little videos about weird maps and weird, fun things about maps. And they're very entertainingly put together, and they're short, but they really put in the extra mile in terms of their production, in terms of going the distance for a bit, let's say. And they've come out with a book called This Way Up: When Maps Go Wrong and Why It Matters.
That sounds delightful.
It was a lot of fun, especially the audiobook, because there are a few bits that translated well / delightfully awkwardly into audiobook format. It is telling all different sorts of stories about maps that maybe have something a bit off about them, and often celebrating this fact, or it is fundamentally a good thing, especially now that we're all getting used to Google Maps and whatever. Mm-hmm. It is good to have maps that go wrong, and how that can make you think about the world in interesting ways, and or reveal things about what's going on. I don't know. It's a very useful thing to think about. And one of the things that I loved about the book is that many of the chapters are not only telling different interesting and true stories, but are also experimenting with the genre, and often in very silly ways. But one chapter is a transcript of a podcast, a very bad podcast in the I want to be Ira Glass kind of style. And it's delightful. There's one that's told entirely through letters, and there's one that's in rhymed verse, and just, you love to encounter that. You love people who are putting out a fun book and are really thinking about it, and are, trying to do, they're not specialists, but they're trying to do the best they can with being accurate, but also being silly in the best, smartest ways. So I had a lot of fun with it.
It sounds wonderful.
It's very good when I couldn't get out of bed.
Yeah, no, I know those are hard times. More movies. I don't
have a lot of brain for movies. I managed to watch one movie for my other podcast. I watched Silent Running. I don't know if you ever saw that one back in the day.
No.
1972 movie starring Bruce Dern as somebody in space taking care of the last bit of forest in a dome on a spaceship, that because all the Earth is paved over, and he becomes a bit of an eco-terrorist about it. I don't think it's a very good movie, though there are some.
It sounds terrible.
Yeah, there are some good visuals in it. My co-host on that podcast, Charlotte, was particularly dismayed by some of the more eco-strident Joan Baez music that would show up at the most inopportune moments.
Oh dear.
Joan Baez is great, but sometimes strident 70s eco singing is a little much.
Yeah.
I don't know. It was something.
Yeah.
You can hear me complain about that elsewhere.
Yeah. No, I have been enjoying a couple of movies lately. I saw Sentimental Value, which is a movie that came out a little bit, like quite recently, directed by Joachim Trier with Stellan Skarsgård in it. It's a Norwegian movie that is actually about drama performance film and the ways in which they bump up against real life. So it actually connects in interesting ways to some of our conversation earlier.
Yeah.
And also, I watched yesterday a terrific film by the director Jafar Panahi, Iranian director, who's probably, people might have heard from because his film, It Was Just an Accident, like just came out. So that's like current. But what I saw was an older film of his from 2015 called Taxi, which, because he was under a prohibition in Iran from doing any kind of filming, it's entirely done inside of a taxi. He's the taxi driver, and people get in and come out and get in and come out. And it's like incredible.
That's such a good gimmick. I mean gimmick in the best way.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. It works incredibly well. So if you do find you have the mental capacity for a movie, and if you get on, like if it's streaming for you somewhere, I strongly recommend it. Taxi.
That does sound up my alley.
It's brilliant, and it's like playing with the genre in this really interesting way.
Oh, hopefully I'll have brain for that sort of thing again
so.
soon. It's so exhausting to be too exhausted to pay attention to things like that.
I know.
And hopefully I'll have the energy to read what I'm planning to read for next month. But until then, listeners, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm. We would always love to hear from you. This show is made possible by people just like you supporting us on Patreon. And patrons get to hang out with us in a friendly Discord. Find out more at patreon.com/megaphonic. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/87. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time.
Until next time, see you again at the Spouter-Inn.